Dr. Sheehan, from your perspective, I'm really curious, what is fueling this, and how do you interpret these recent killings in light of the military and political setbacks that Tehran has faced, particularly after the 12-day conflict and the organized resistance?
Well, Mark, it's good to be with you. I would open by noting that it's very clear that the Iranian regime is panicked. It's panicked because it recognizes that it's no longer governing from a position of strength. It's governing from a position of fear. Even setting aside the current existential crisis confronting the Ayatollahs, the writing has been on the wall for quite some time. The fact of the matter is the Iranian people have grown tired, deeply tired, of living under a corrupt and repressive theocracy. And the discontent on the Iranian street has reached a new high this summer. This fatigue is manifested in unmistakable ways. The public rejection of the regime, as demonstrated by literally dozens of nationwide uprisings in recent years, makes one thing quite clear. The system is at a breaking point. The days of portraying dissent as isolated or externally manufactured are over. The chants we're hearing in the streets, rejecting both the supreme leader and the Shah, signal something quite profound. And that is that Iranians are no longer seeking simple reform of their government. They're no longer seeking regime modification. They're seeking fundamental democratic change. The panic in Tehran stems from the realization that the question is no longer if the regime will fall, but when. Mark, it's important that we not sugarcoat this in the West. Economically, the situation is catastrophic. The Iranian currency has been in a decline all summer. Inflation is strangling the average citizen. Corruption is endemic. And while regime elites continue to line their pockets, everyday Iranians are forced to choose between food and medicine. Internally, the cracks in the regime's foundation are widening. Cleavages within the ruling class among clerics and IRGC commanders and intelligence officials, they're all on full display for the world to see. And the loyalties, once taken for granted, are no longer guaranteed. Day to day and week to week, there are purges and silences that speak volumes and signs of deep mistrust, even within the core institutions that have historically enforced repression. Externally, the regime's regional adventurism has also backfired. Its destabilizing influence from Lebanon to Yemen has only deepened its isolation and undermined its credibility abroad. And perhaps most importantly, the regime today faces a resistance movement inside and outside the country that is more sophisticated and more networked and more determined than ever before. These are not disorganized expressions of protest. What we're witnessing today are all of the ingredients for a full-scale revolt from within. So you ask, why is the regime panicked? Well, it's panicked because it knows that its model of governance, built on brutality and advanced through deceit and reliant on fear, is unsustainable in the face of a population that's simply no longer afraid. It's watching the pillars of its authority fold like a deck of cards. Iran's leaders today lack the political, economic, ideological, and moral will to govern. And those at the top understand something that outside observers are only beginning to fully grasp, but scholars have long understood, and that's this. Once popular momentum reaches a certain threshold, authoritarian regimes don't gradually fade away. They often unravel quite swiftly. Mark, I participated in more than a dozen interviews during the 12-day war earlier this summer. And since this time, I've had some opportunity to reflect on what we witnessed. And I believe there are three irrefutable lessons from that conflict. The first is that the supreme leader's strategy has failed. The regime crossed a clear red line with its near weapons grade enrichment and paid the price with targeted strikes. But perhaps more telling than what happened is what didn't. The fact of the matter is, Russia and China didn't come to Tehran's defense. And this silence confirmed what the Iranian resistance has long warned, that the regime's supposed alliances are hollow and its international isolation is deeper than it claims. The second lesson we learned is that diplomacy with the regime is reaching its end, even in Europe. After years of failed negotiations, deceit, and nuclear blackmail, even Europe is beginning to acknowledge the futility of appeasement and threatening the regime with triggering the snapback mechanism. The diplomatic framework that allowed the Islamic Republic to stall and then enrich and ultimately deceive is collapsing. And what comes next is not a new round of talks with Europe to kill time, but facing conditions that will cost this regime its survival. And the third lesson that we learned this summer is this: the regime's greatest fear is its internal organized resistance. Iran's supreme leader doesn't fear foreign airstrikes as much as he fears what's rising from within. And that is the people of Iran, organized and determined to take back their future. And that's why his response, Mark, after the war wasn't diplomatic outreach. It was a wave of political execution, targeting MEK members and the dissident community. This is not a regime acting from a position of strength. It's one cracking under pressure and lashing out at its most feared threat, and that is internal rebellion by an organized pro-democracy alternative.